Hello friends, welcome back to my show. The word gender fluidity is very much in the news. It has been used by our Honorable Chief Justice of India in a case relating to same-sex marriages. But very few of us really know the origin of this phrase and the barbaric and bad science behind it. Sadly, none of the commentators, both on social media as well as on the mainstream media, seem to know or talk about it. So let us dig in a little deeper to really understand the term gender fluidity, which is used so loosely today without understanding the real meaning of the term. First, I'll begin with a disclaimer. This video is not about same-sex marriage. It is about certain phrases which are being used by the highest authorities in the Supreme Court of India, and those phrases are being used very loosely. In particular, it is about gender fluidity as an argument. There is no opinion that is expressed about the Supreme Court or the judicial officers. And finally, as the Supreme Court has directed in another case, if you are offended, please stop watching. I'll not waste much time on the headlines because all of you must have seen similar things both in the print media as well as on the televisions and the social media too. Sex and gender are two terms that are often used interchangeably, and often people are confused about the differences. So let us get some clarity. First term is sex. This is a biological fact. It is determined by the genitalia, the private parts of a child at birth, and that determines whether that person is a male or a female or a third gender or an indeterminate gender at birth. The next term that comes is expression or gender expression. This is how a person presents publicly, and the terms that come into picture are femininity or feminine and masculine or masculinity. And these pertain to how a person presents publicly in dress, gesture, speech, etc. The third thing that we ought to know is gender identity. And remember, gender identity is all in the brain. It is the individual's feeling of gender identification, the womanness or the manness. It has nothing to do with the biology. But when we are talking about marriage, it is a matter of the heart. Is science, let alone a private club of judges, evolved enough to handle that? Let's see. Once something is defined, we are very happy to use the terms. But first, let us find out who made these definitions. These words were coined by one John Money, who lived from 1921 to 2006. He was a New Zealand-born psychologist and researcher, but he did most of his work at Johns Hopkins University in the United States, and his field was sexual identity and biology of gender. But we shall return to him later. Before that, let us consider some other matters. We are talking about a case in the court of law, which is going to be judged by a panel of judges or a bench of judges. So would it not be in order if we were to take stock of the abilities of judges? I'm not questioning their intellect or their fairness. I'm just talking about their limitations and the ecosystem within which they work. Here is what a research paper of Cornell University has to say. This paper was published in 2001 and the URL is shown on the screen. What it says is, and I quote from this paper, even the most talented and dedicated judges surely make mistakes, but the public understandably expects judges to avoid systematic errors. This expectation, however, might be unrealistic. I continue with a quotation from Inside the Judicial Mind, a paper published in 2001, and it says, people frequently fall prey to cognitive illusions that produce systematic errors in judgment. Even though judges are experienced, well-trained, and highly motivated decision makers, they are vulnerable to cognitive illusions. Please mark the words that have been underlined. And finally, what we find is that in the sample of 167 federal judges, we found that each of the 5 illusions that we tested had a significant impact on judicial decision making. In other words, each of the 167 judges who were studied in this survey were found to be falling victim to 2 or more of 5 illusions, about which we shall talk shortly. So what are these 5 illusions? The 5 illusions that affect the judicial mind are: number 1, anchoring, which is subconscious use of irrelevant information, using stuff that is not relevant to the case. The next one is number 2, framing, which is interpretation through a collection of anecdotes and stereotypes that individuals rely on to understand. In other words, analogies that don't really apply. Those things are known as framing. Next is hindsight bias, which is to convince themselves after an event has happened that what they had accurately predicted before has happened. This is a kind of patting your own back, and judges can be equally susceptible as other people in other fields of life. Number 4 is representative heuristics. This is making categorical judgments. For example, if I say all dogs bark, does it follow that if some dog does not bark, it is not a dog? Definitely there's something wrong with my logical, deductive and inductive thinking. This is point number 4, which is representative heuristics. And the fifth and last one, which was used by the people who did the study, was egocentric biases, which happens when they rely too heavily on their own perspective and or have a higher opinion of oneself than reality, which is very likely to happen when you are in the top court sitting in judgment of an important matter. It is very easy to assume and have a higher opinion of oneself. Now, these are facts collated from a definitive survey which was published by one of the most prestigious law publications. At the end of the video, you'll be able to judge for yourself without any prompts from me how you're going to use this information. Let us now take a quick look at the leading influences on the Chief Justice of India.
Feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw introduced the concept of intersectionality.
Here is another influence.
Suraj Yengde, a prolific writer, has written in his book Caste Matters.
And this is yet another leading influence from Harvard.
The caste of merit, engineering education in India.
You can hear the entire hour-long speech which the Chief Justice gave at IIT Delhi on YouTube. And you will find that the principal illusions that emerge are intersectionality, critical race theory, the caste of merit, popular wokeism, activism, and of course, gender fluidity. In this video, we shall limit ourselves to gender fluidity, but remember that each one of these principal illusions is going to taint the final judgment. The graphic that you see on the screen now is a Google Ngram, and it's actually a plot which shows how the frequency of the use of the term gender fluidity has changed over time. Up until 1990, the word or phrase gender fluidity was hardly ever used. Then it gradually started gaining use until 2004. And then suddenly there was an exponential growth after 2012. Otherwise, it was lying quite flat between 2004 and 2012. Year 2012 was when Obama publicly gave support to the LGBTQ plus issues. So now let us get back to John Money, the man who defined gender and sex for us. He said gender is not innate and that it is a learned behavior. Biologists tell us that there are broadly two kinds of behavior which is exhibited by animals, and they are innate behavior and learned behavior. Innate behavior is present at birth, and it is usually inflexible, with given stimulus triggering a given response. Whereas learned behavior is capable of modification and is subject to improvement through practice. Please mark these words carefully. The story of John Money begins and ends with the Reimer family. It is a very traumatic story. There was this young couple, Ron and Janet Reimer. Ron was a blue-collar worker, and to them were born twin sons in the year 1965. They were named as Bruce and Brian, Bruce being the older one, who developed phimosis, a condition where the foreskin of the penis does not have sufficient opening. And for this, the doctors recommended circumcision. So far, the story is quite comfortable. Sadly, the surgery that happened on the 27th of April 1966 was a disaster. The cauterization equipment malfunctioned, and the little boy's penis was completely burnt off. This was really traumatic. However, 1 year later, the parents were watching a television program in which they saw John Money. He was heading a new center for gender and sex research at the renowned Johns Hopkins University Hospital. So they decided to consult him for this particular traumatic condition which was suffered by Bruce. He consulted and said that the best advice for them would be to go in for a sex change for Bruce. John Money was an ardent follower of B.F. Skinner, who had founded the school of thought known as behaviorism, and he felt that any boy could be reassigned as a girl, and what mattered really was nurture rather than nature alone. This was in fact the first statement of gender fluidity, a term which has stuck on even though it was proved to be wrong, as we shall see later in this video. The Reimer boys were the perfect example which would serve his purpose, because they were two boys who were twins. They were raised by the same family in the same circumstances, and this would be the crowning glory of his career. It would make him both rich as well as famous. So Money directed the surgeons to remove whatever was left of the penis. Next, the testicles were removed, and a female vulva was fashioned over there in its place by surgeons. After this, hormonal treatment was started, and at the same time, Bruce became Brenda, and the parents started raising that boy as a girl. Money followed the case for more than 10 years. It was an ideal experiment. The twins share the same DNA, they are brought up in the same home, and the younger twin brother was the perfect experimental control, a necessity for blind trials. But the story just doesn't end there. During the 10 years that he consulted these kids and the parents, what Money practiced was both perverted and unethical. And the details can be found in the biography by John Colapinto, and it is available on Amazon India. Money forced both the kids to have a rehearsal of sex play at the age of 6 years of age. Brian was the male and Brenda was the female. The play included thrusting and mimicked copulation. For example, getting them on all fours or spreading their legs. All this was photographed for the record. I hate to go into the details, but the story of gender fluidity must be told to all those who wish to use that term so easily and fluently. Colapinto's book gives one particular instance. Here is what Brenda is quoted as saying during an interview. He told me to take my clothes off, and I just did not do it. I just stood there, and he screamed, "Now!" Louder than that, in fact. I thought he was going to give me a whopping. So I took my clothes off and stood there shaking. Meanwhile, Money was acclaimed as a great scientist for his Joan and John experiment because it clearly demonstrated Skinner's theory and it served as the gold standard of evidence. He authored more than 65 papers, but in real life, what really happened was that Brian, the younger of the two siblings, developed schizophrenia. And Brenda, the person who was made into a female through forcible surgery, had actually got to urinate through a hole in the abdomen. All this while, hormones were pumped in to develop breasts. As a matter of fact, because of all this traumatic clinical experimentation, Brenda became suicidal at the age of 13. All these happenings were taking a heavy toll on the minds and hearts of the family. Finally, at the age of 14, on the 14th of March 1980, the parents told the child, Bruce turned Brenda, about his sexual reassignment. Brenda was aghast and traumatized and decided to name herself as David, and she once again wanted to be a boy that she always had been, just as nature had willed. Respecting the wishes of Brenda, who had now turned David, the doctors got into the task of reversing the damage. Testosterone injections were started in order to develop male characteristics. A double mastectomy had to be done to remove the breasts which had started developing, and a phalloplasty operation was carried out, which means reconstruction of a penis by taking tissue and muscle from the arm or from the thigh. Following this, the poor child had to be rehabilitated as a male all over again. David now started building up his life. He started working as a janitor, and on 22nd of September 1990, he got married to one Jane Fontaine. And through this marriage, he stepfathered 3 children. Unfortunately, his brother Brian was traumatized and he became a drug addict, and he finally died due to an overdosage of narcotic drugs. This marriage sadly only lasted till 2004, which is when Jane and David separated. This sad, horrendous and traumatic tale ended on the 4th of May 2004. That was the day when David committed suicide by shooting himself in a parking lot. That day, Bruce, Brenda and David, all 3 got release from John Money. And now it is time for us to give gender fluidity a decent burial. It has already caused enough grief and misery. So this brings us back to the use of the term gender fluidity in this judicial battle. It assumes particular significance when we realize that the reading list recommended by the Chief Justice promotes wokeism, critical race theory, caste of merit, intersectionality, and gender fluidity. From this example, we saw that no one has bothered to go into the roots of this phrase. How inappropriate was the use of this phrase in the present case, which is before the bench of 5 judges. Let us take a look at those sitting in judgment on the bench. The information that you see on the screen is taken from the Supreme Court website, and the URL for this is shown on the screen. These 5 leading luminaries on the bench are persons whose last brush with science was when they graduated from high school. They are all bachelors of arts. Not a single one of them is a science graduate. How will they know about John Money and his experiments? Who amongst them will dare to question the authority of John Money? After all, their thinking is governed by the literature being churned out by Harvard and the one that they are recommending, especially in their speeches, to august bodies such as IIT Delhi students. So friends, is it not the time to introspect? Gender fluidity as a concept is rooted in perverted research and bogus science, and it ruined 2 families and drove 2 young lads to death. And finally, it also forced Johns Hopkins to close down the very center which was founded by Mr. John Money. Friends, we saw how 5 illusions had affected 167 judges. Every single judge in the research published by Cornell Law School was affected in some way or the other by these illusions. These illusions were anchoring, framing, hindsight bias, heuristic bias, and egoistic bias. Is the situation any different in the present case? Can we say that the people sitting in judgment on the bench are free from all these? It is time to introspect and to examine. Friends, we must remember that words, word roots, and cultural origins of language are of prime importance for the development and growth of a society. So please tell me, what is your opinion? I must thank you for your kind attention and time that you spared for watching this video. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And until we meet again, bye-bye.